Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes, buenas noches, depending on where you are in the country today or in the world. My name is Jasmine Chavez, and I am the Vice President of Grant Making and Programs for Hispanics in Philanthropy. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome every single one of you to our charla today on our migrant souls. I don't know about y'all, but this is one of my favorite books that I've been reading at least the last 2 years. It is a book that I make my students read in their college classes. It's a book that I share with my loved ones. It's a book that speaks to my heart, that really identifies for me as growing up undocumented in this country and having mentors and teachers share our stories of who we are. So I am so excited for this conversation, and it is brought to you by a group of powerful, powerful folks. We are joined today by Paulina Vera, who's the president of the HNBA out of DC. Also Maritza Perez Medina, who is out of the Drug Policy Alliance, doing incredible work. We'll be moderating the panel with Hector Tobar today. So thank you so, so much for joining us as part of Hispanics in Philanthropy. We are so excited to have this conversation. And welcome, bienvenidos. And I will hand it off to Paulina. Bienvenidos.
Gracias, Yasmin, for that introduction. So yes, my name is Paulina Vera. I am proud to be the president of the Hispanic Bar Association of DC, established in 1977. We are an organization of over 500 law students, lawyers, and judges here in the DC area, and we support Latino legal professionals in their careers at various stages. So whether that's through our mentorship program, our Evening With series, featuring prominent Latino attorneys who are just killing it in their careers. We have a judicial pipeline project to encourage more Latinos in the judiciary. So we are definitely very busy. And while we definitely have differences in, our backgrounds, the countries of origin that we're originally from, our immigration stories, I think that there is also a lot that unites us. And we have a lot of shared experiences about navigating this profession, just navigating being Latino here in the United States. What does that mean? And so I could not think of a better event that resonates some of these questions that we tackle with than this book chat this evening. And so to that end, I am proud to introduce a good friend of mine, Maritza Perez Medina, who is herself a past president of HBADC. And she is also a civil rights attorney, currently working as the Director of Federal Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance in DC, where she manages the organization's federal legislative agenda and advocacy strategy in Congress. And in that work, Maritza definitely touches the lives of many Latinos in the United States. So again, she really is just the perfect person, I think, to moderate this conversation this evening. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Maritza, who will introduce the author and get that discussion kicked off tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Paulina, and really a huge thank you to HIP and the HBADC for co-sponsoring this conversation that I'm really excited about. So I'd like to bring our guest of honor to the stage, Hector Tobar. He's the author of six books published in 15 different languages, including the book that we're going to talk about today, Our Migrant Souls. Hector is a professor of English and Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and National Geographic, and was a contributing writer for the New York Times opinion pages. Hector has also been a columnist for the LA Times and its bureau chief in both Buenos Aires and Mexico City. Welcome, Hector.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Before we get started, I just want to remind the audience that we want to hear from you. I want this to be a lively conversation. So as things come to mind, as you hear us chat, feel free to drop any questions that you have for the author in the chat. You can use the Zoom chat or you can use the Q&A function on the Zoom. But we want to hear from you, so feel free to drop your questions whenever they come to mind. So actually, I feel like Paulina gave already a great introduction because, Hector, I know I shared with you when we were preparing for this phone call that your book really explored a lot of the questions that I myself as a Latina contemplate all the time. I think in the US, people try to pretend that the Latino identity is something that is, not as fluid as it actually is. And we've seen that over time from not only the different words that have been used to describe us, right? But also, we have different histories in this country, different migration histories. We have different races, different ethnicities. And yes, there are things that unite us culturally, including sometimes language and sometimes food, but it's complex. And, I think there's really an underappreciation of that complexity. So your book, really made me feel like, wow, I'm not crazy. There are other people who are also feeling these things. So if you've ever, contemplated the Latino identity, this is definitely a perfect book to pick up. But let's get into it. I know that you haven't written nonfiction for quite some time before writing this book. So I wanted to hear about what inspired you to come out with this book, specifically because you took a break from nonfiction for a bit.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Hispanics in Philanthropy and everyone involved in putting this call together. To you, Maritza, for being in La Couture today, and also to everyone. So thank you for having me. Yeah, the book is born. This work of nonfiction is born of my experiences as a professor at University of California, Irvine. I serve at what we call in California a Hispanic serving institution. It's 40% Latino, the University of California, Irvine. And my students come from all over the United States, and specifically from all over California. They come from places as diverse as South Central Los Angeles, historic East Los Angeles, the Coachella Valley, the Central Valley. And, I'm a writer, so I ask my students to tell me stories. And the stories they tell are of growing up in a country very much different from the country that I grew up in, a country of ever greater inequality, of ever greater stratification of identities in terms of legal identities, right? There are so many different legal categories that apply to Latino and other immigrants. And I just felt a lot of anger and pain, confusion, pride, just all the gamut of emotions of people who are living through a time in history of inequality and struggle and triumph also. And so, I wanted to speak to that, and I also wanted to place it within United States history, because really that's what Latino is. Latino is a construction of an identity within the history of the United States. The way we use it in our conversations in Washington, in Los Angeles, Chicago, or in Kansas, that's what Latino is. And especially the contradictions in Latino, the cruelty of ideas, racist ideas about Latino people, all came to the fore for me really during the George Floyd spring, when we were having this national conversation about race. Many white Americans were waking up to the notion of anti-Blackness and how powerful it is in our country. And yet I believe that the idea of Latino and especially brown-skinned mestizo immigrant Latinos as a danger to America is really the central racist idea in our society right now. And so I wanted to write a book that took that apart, and also that that gave my students, that gave that generation the tool, the power of understanding how these racist ideas are rooted in American history.
Yeah, and you've already touched on this a bit with the relationship that you have with your students, and I loved that you open up the book by talking about that relationship. You speak of your students with such love and care, and I had very few. Actually, I think I told you this in our prep call. I had one Latino professor throughout my college career, and he was the first Latino I had encountered in academia. And I just think about how special that relationship is, and how he also empowered me. And it feels like, part of the desire for writing this book was not only to share their stories, but to also perhaps empower them as well. Would you say that that's right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something that most of the people on this call have done, themselves in their lives, which isn't just the work that we do. You as an attorney, all the people who work in the philanthropy or who are listening, who are in our audience. It's the example that you give. You give the example of yourself as a proud person, as someone connected to your heritage, and someone also who is a fighter and someone who lives an intellectual life. And so my book is also an intellectual exercise. It's an invitation to my readers to understand their struggles and their experience as this, as this intellectual process that an experience where an intellectual process can give you clarity and empower you. And so, yes, absolutely. I think that's it's and also I have to say the tone of the book and the direct address to my students is inspired by James Baldwin's great book, The Fire Next Time, where he writes the preface to the book is written as an essay to his nephew during the height of Jim Crow and civil rights movement in early 1960s. And so, yes, I think it's definitely an attempt to start a conversation and to make people feel, to give the example of the power that we feel as thinkers and writers and activists.
So another opening part of the book begins with the Donner Party and talking about the Latinos involved in the Donner Party.
Right.
And as a Latina who grew up in Nevada, I was always very intrigued by the Donner Party and how all of that went down. What was the purpose, I guess, of including the story of the Latinos, who I will say are often overlooked in all of this? It's not something that you read about often, but can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, I've always been kind of a history geek. I have a lot of books on the shelf right now behind me that are history books, and I've been a history geek since I was a young person, growing up in LA. And the story of the Donner Party was one I always knew. I mean, it's the story of the pioneers attempting to cross to California in the 1840s before the Mexican War. Actually, they set off before the Mexican War started, and getting caught up there in the Sierra Nevada. But only after seeing the latest documentary when I was in my 40s did I realize that there was a Mexicano, a Latino guy in the Donner Party, and his name was Antonio. And that's all we know. I mean, I searched through as many, much of the historical record as I could, and Antonio's never given a last name. And then I heard his story, which is that he's hired as a teamster in Missouri on this journey to California that the Donner Party takes, and he they get stuck in the mountains. He dies of cold and starvation, and they eat him. They eat his body. These white people eat their Mexican driver. It sounds like something from a horror movie, and yet it's true, and it's this historical truth that's been absolutely ignored. And so to me, that was a story that served as a kind of introduction, as an allegory to the relationship between Mexico and the United States, because that story takes place at the same time that the Southwest is being stolen by the United States from Mexico. When Antonio crosses from Missouri to California, he's going back home to his home country because he's Mexican, right? He's a Mexican guy, but when the Donner Party gets to California, they discover that the Mexican War has broken out, and John Fremont, the general, has taken over Northern California. And so if Antonio had made it to California, he would have discovered that he lost his country. And they crossed a border. They crossed the Mexican border to go into Mexico. And so it led into this discussion of what the border is. The border is this arbitrary line drawn to between two empires because one empire defeated another, and they turned the people that they had conquered into colonial subjects, in effect. And so to me, that story was really useful. It's a story that little kids read about. My daughter read a child's version of this called The Donner Dinner Party. And so it's so commonly known, but nobody knows the story of poor Antonio the Teamster.
Until now.
Until now.
Yeah. So something else I really appreciated about your book was you really capturing the pride in the contributions Latinos have made to the US by literally building this country through its infrastructure. And this is particularly relevant now in a very unfortunate circumstance, right? What we saw with the Baltimore Bridge.
Absolutely.
It totally reminded me of what you talk about in this book, that like we have literally built this country's infrastructure and are so invisibilized in many ways. But can you tell us more about that?
Well, yeah, to me, it's one of the great insults of the stereotypes of Latino people as dangerous, as people who are from this barbarous countries, and they need to be kept behind this wall. And as public charges, I mean, that's part of the stereotype that the right circulates about us, is that we are lazy, shiftless people who've come here to come here to collect welfare and to vote Democratic. There's all these conspiracy theories. But really, one of the horrible, insidious thing about it is that Latinos are constructors of order in this country. So, there's this image of the cartel, which is the cartel operative, the sicario, is the dominant image of Latino people in American media. So as agents of chaos. And yet what Latino people do is they keep the roads smooth, like those workers in Baltimore who are working in the middle of the night so as to not inconvenience, the drivers across that bridge. That's why they were working at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Constructors of order in the neighborhood where I live in a middle class neighborhood upper middle class neighborhood in Los Angeles, and the vans come in every day, vans and the pickup trucks of construction workers, gardeners, plumbers, just a constant stream. I can hear them working right now. They're working on the building right below my house. They're rebuilding this house that had been taken over by squatters. So this neighborhood has homeless people who move in, and it's the Latino guys who are fixing up the house so that they can sell it and bring it back into useful property. So Latino people construct this order all over the country, and it's something that goes back to the 19th century. The agricultural infrastructure of California and Texas was built by Mexican workers. And I could go on, and it's just, and in fact, what happens though is that white America erases Latino workers from the image of American order, and that makes white people seem more powerful. And so it creates this myth. It adds to the sort of myth of white superiority. All of these are subliminal messages that are sent to us by the portrayal of Latino people in the media. And yet, when something tragic happens, as that disaster, it shows how much the country really depends on Latino workers and immigrant workers specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, you also share some important history related to the southern border, which I feel like is always relevant and important because a lot of people really don't know that history. But I think it's even more important now in an election year because inevitably, every election year, I feel like all eyes are back on the southern border. So it's a really important history to share. I want to give you the floor on that, though. Like, why was that an integral piece of including in this book?
Well, yeah, the southern border, what's happening on the southern border is a performance that has been a drama that has been staged by American policy. That they have created this image of chaos and crisis. And it's something that is also the existence of the border is something that's just normal in American history because the United States has always created categories of workers who can be seen as outsiders, be they the Chinese working on the railroads in the 19th century, Eastern Europeans coming to build, the cities of the Midwest, African slaves being brought in to establish Southern agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And so the border, to me, and I argue this in my book, is just one more element in trying to construct a race identity in this country. So in other words, the country has this love-hate, dependency, hatred relationship with immigrant labor. The country wouldn't eat without immigrant labor. More than half the crops in the country are picked by undocumented immigrants, right? And yet when there are so many Latino immigrants, it transforms American cities and towns culturally. People begin to intermarry. The countries change racially. And so the constructors of race order the people who benefit politically from these racist ideas, they've established these policies which led to the construction of the border fence. You know, there's a picture, if you can look it up online, of what the border between Mexico and the United States looked like in the 1970s, before Operation Gatekeeper, before all of the construction of the fences in the late 1990s, and it's of Pat Nixon at the border fence, at the border park, Friendship Park, the border between the United States and Mexico, where they had built a park by the beach in San Diego, Tijuana. And she's reaching through 2 strands of barbed wire to take the baby of a Mexican man who's trying to give her the baby. And so the fence was nothing. It was just like 2 or 3 strands of barbed wire. They built a park there to encourage international friendship. And now it's become this scar, these like 3 layers of metal that famously cut through all the way to the ocean, right? They go into the water. And so that border is the result of a policy that attempts to transform Latino people into a dangerous other, into this barbarous horde that needs to be kept on the other side of the fence, while at the same time the country is ever more dependent on Latino labor. And that's the contradiction of that fence. And you can see, you know, to see the way it developed. I mean, it was arbitrarily put there after the Mexican War. The diplomats who drew the line had never been there before. They just drew a line on a map, and then the surveyors from Mexico and the United States had to go out and decide where to put it. So the whole thing is an arbitrary construction. You know, there was nothing there. There was a ranch at the U.S. border, where the U.S. border reaches the sea. There was a ranch called the Tijuana, you know, Aunt Juana's ranch, and now it's Tijuana. Everything that, you know, so you know, I think it's really kind of empowering to see how arbitrary the you know, the drawing of the line and the construction of all these border fences really has been over history.
So there's a passage in your book that I think really summarizes that fiction and those policy choices. And I'm going to read a snippet of this. And if you have your book, it's page 134. The mass killing at the southwestern border is achieved through passive means, and in this fashion, it perfectly fits the modern American character. The desert is a natural machinery of death set in motion by policymakers who can deny trying to kill anyone, or who can shift the blame to the dead themselves. The deaths at the border serve the same function as a public execution. Untold numbers of potential immigrants are dissuaded from undertaking the journey. And in the United States, the sense among Latino people that we are a lesser beaten down caste is deepened. In this fashion, the ultimate goal of U.S. immigration policy is achieved now as in the 20th and 19th centuries, the preservation and protection of the white character of the United States. I think that's such a powerful passage. It brings up a lot for me. I would say most notably how these are policy choices, and these are needless deaths. We know how to prevent these deaths, and we're choosing not to.
Right, and you know, Jason De Leon, this UCLA anthropologist, did a great work on the deaths at the border, and where, you know, and he and others you know, have found the documents in the when the United States started Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line and began building fences along the border. They said one of the measures of the success of this plan will be an increase in people crossing at these spots where they will die. And you know, and Jason De Leon's work, in which he argues that the actual number of deaths is much larger than the number of bodies that are being found, because the desert has these natural processes that erase the cadavers. And they actually went and took a couple of pig cadavers and documented what happens to a body in the desert. And so those bodies are being turned, in effect, to ashes. And to me, it's akin, I'm not saying there's an immoral equivalency, but they're actually events on the same sort of, the same continuum of history, which is what the Nazis did with the Jews. You know, they transformed the corpses into ashes to erase the evidence of their crime and to protect the German people from the horror of what they were doing. And so that's what's happening is the United States policymakers are are trying to protect the American voting public from the horrors of what they're actually doing.
Yeah, and it also makes me think of like actually something I read in the news just this week that deaths are once again increasing at the border, where in the past there would be 2 to 3 bodies recovered at the border in a month in a specific county that borders with Texas and Mexico. Now that's the number of people that they're seeing a day, and they don't have the resources to even identify who these individuals are. But these are all policy choices.
Absolutely.
These are policy objectives, and I would argue that policies like Operation Lone Star in Texas, what's the goal? They know that deaths are increasing, and then this is they're not saying it out loud, but what else can we surmise? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, I was also fascinated by your story on being neighbors with a man who assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That's just a super fascinating tidbit. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I grew up in East Hollywood, California, which is now known as Little Armenia. My parents migrated from Guatemala in the 1960s, and I grew up on a little street called Harold Way, and very racially mixed neighborhood. Everybody, Eastern Europeans, Latinos, Filipinos, and so I grew up there, and like I said, I'm a history geek. And 10, 15 years ago, I read a great book called Killing the Dream about the assassination of Martin Luther King by Gerald Posner. And I noticed that James Earl Ray had lived on this street that was right behind my house. And I got the old maps out. I went and looked up in the library the old maps, and James Earl Ray's old apartment is still there. My duplex has been knocked down, so I got the old maps and I saw that my house was right behind his apartment. I mean, there was a little fence in the back next to our incinerator, and behind that fence, that cinder block fence, is where his apartment was. And I thought about that because I was also trying to write about how I lost my innocence about race. Like a lot of people, I grew up with my parents trying to protect me from the notion that there was racist people out there. They always told me I was special and didn't really dwell on the sort of racial inequality and the discrimination that I know that they faced. And so I started thinking about how I lost my innocence. And about that same time that I was a little kid, my parents were getting divorced and there was some, accusations of infidelity. And I thought, oh my God, this neighborhood where I grew up, there was much more going on than I realized. My father and mother were involved in relationships with other people, perhaps. And I had this neighbor who was this assassin, this racist. It was a very transient neighborhood. And the other part of that story is that my godfather, the man who drove my mother to the hospital when my mother was pregnant, was an African American guy from Memphis, Tennessee, who happened to be taking Spanish classes at LA City College, a few blocks away from the part where my parents were living. And I discovered when I was in my 40s, I discovered that he was a civil rights activist with the NAACP, and he had been arrested in Memphis for trying to integrate the segregated Memphis Central Public Library. So I realized when I thought about these stories, when I thought about my godfather, Booker Wade, the African-American activist, when I thought about James Earl Ray, the assassin, I realized that I had grown up inside of this American drama. And that's part of what it means to be Latino to me, is that I've grown up in this United States story, this story of anti-Black racism, white supremacy, resistance, and my story, and in the course of my lifetime, I've learned how my story has become part of that story. So to me, it was a very spiritual kind of experience to write about that. And I also realized that James Earl Ray grew up dirt poor, and the more I read about his life, he grew up very, very poor in the Midwest. And he grew up among Black people. I think I'm the first. I didn't do that much original historical research, but I did look up the census records from where James Earl Ray was born in a town in Illinois. He was born on a street where there were Black residents from Mississippi and Texas, Eastern Europeans too, and Irish people. He grew up in a very poor neighborhood, very poor mixed neighborhood. And so part of what he was doing was his hatred towards Martin Luther King was the hatred of the poverty that surrounded him, and attached to this horrible ideology, this anti-Black ideology. So, the more you look deeper into history, the more you see things that explain relationships to you. And so that story explained a lot to me.
Yeah, and also what you shared about his background reminds me of like the populism that we hear about today, where,
Yes.
right? Like that's exactly what that reminds me of. So a reminder for our audience, please drop any questions that you have in our chat or our Q&A function. We will turn to audience questions in about 15 minutes or so. But shifting gears here, you also talk about guns in your book, and you refer to them as a tool of colonial subjugation, which is, I think, accurate, especially when you think about US history. And, I've always said that the Second Amendment is only for white people because they're the only ones who appear to be able to freely use guns. But can you tell us about how you connect gun violence, largely committed by white men, to, what you're describing throughout the book, which is Latino identity?
Right. Yeah, I think, wow. Well, I went to El Paso to the Walmart where this horrible shooting took place, where, that's wrong that I said it that way because I put it in the passive voice. In El Paso, where a white man came and murdered a bunch of people of Latino descent because he wanted to start a race war, essentially. That's what was happening with him. And I think that for me, of the tradition of American violence is one that has its roots in the colonial experience and in manifest destiny and in slavery. So the United States is the colonies that become the United States are founded, in an environment where there are other peoples, and those other peoples resist. There are violent encounters. That's one of the reasons why the Second Amendment exists, is because of this tradition of armed resistance and self-defense in very violent places. And of course, slavery requires violence to keep its order. And so to me, this country, unique among Western developed countries, has this deeper relationship with guns because of its unique history, because of the so-called frontier and because of slavery. And so when someone commits a massacre, not just the ones against Latino people, or like the man in Las Vegas who shot, shot a concert, or all of the one, they're all, to me, they're sort of they're kind of reenacting of the colonial experience, right? Of this experience of one man against the masses that threaten and harass him. And this is just a really deep part of our country's character. And so to me, to be Latino very often means a physical, for a lot of people, especially working class people, there is a physical humiliation involved. Segregation was legal right up until the 1950s and 60s. De facto segregation still exists in many American cities, and that segregation is often enforced by the agents of the law. I mean, there's a whole reading of the way criminal laws are applied, in that they are applied to maintain this uneven social order. And so there are a lot of young people who have almost like a muscle memory of resistance, of physical resistance. And so we see that, that male desire to resist humiliation at work and so much senseless violence that takes place in our neighborhoods. So to me, all of that, its DNA is colonialism, whether it be the colonialism of the Pilgrims or the colonialism of the Aztecs, against all these indigenous groups, that people have always been subjected to, and it's really deep inside of us. I think that a lot of us carry traumas from that. My wife is Mexican American, Chicana, from here in Northeast LA. She has her father and her uncles, in detention in Los Angeles, the LAPD. She has an uncle who died in police custody. And so there's a lot of memory of this, of humiliation and pain that continues to this day.
I was muted. I was
Yes.
saying, you know, and especially when you talk about the El Paso shooting, it doesn't escape me that that was in Texas, where we've seen horrific violence
Right.
on scale before. I mean, talk about colonial subjugation. I mean, the Texas Rangers, like they were out here lynching people before, you know,
Right.
during and before and after the Mexican-American War for land, for jobs, for many reasons. But that didn't escape me. It also doesn't escape me that, you know, the role that certain individuals have, certain individuals with large platforms. You know, at the time, President Trump was very vocal about his hatred toward immigrants, Mexicans in particular, calling them rapists, among other things, framing immigration as an invasion. You know, of course, he stoked some of those flames. But I think the irony of all of this is that, I mean, it is colonial, right? Because the irony is that we are indigenous to this land, like literally, we are indigenous to this continent. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because that was like the first thing that came up for me when I heard about, you know, the horrible thing that happened in El Paso. So moving on here, you know, when I picked up this book, I thought that you might go into this debate around what do we call ourselves? Because, you know, we think it's going to, you know, it implies that the book will be about Latino identity. So I'm like, okay, I think I have like an opinion about that. But you don't take an opinion on that. You know, you do talk about that what we're called in this country has shifted from being labeled as quote unquote mulattoes to even mestizos to Espanol to now Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, Latine. You point all of this out, but again, you don't make a point to, you know, say which way, like how we should identify ourselves or engage in that debate. Can you tell me more about like why you made that decision, and what you were trying to draw out with just like naming the different things that we have been called?
Yeah, I think that a lot of my thinking about this has been informed by a great African American historian, Nell Irvin Painter. And she wrote a book called The History of White People, which basically takes apart the origins of the idea of white, where that comes from. Because no human being is white. I mean, we're all basically brown, you know, no one human being is black. No one's, you know, and so where do those ideas come from? And so I began to take apart, you know, where these notions of you know, us as an identity come from. And the first thing I realize is that every ethnicity or racial category, because Latino is supposed to be an ethnicity, but very often people treat it as a race category. So suspects, for example, are defined as Black suspects, Asian suspects, Hispanic suspects. It's the same category. You see the same thing with the demographic pies, whatever. So all of those categories, race or ethnic, really are pan-ethnicities. They're categories where many different kinds of people are sort of thrown together or assembled together. And there's two things that work in the creation of those labels. Number one is that they're created to explain exploitation. So white and black are created to explain why some people own slaves and others are slaves. And they become legal categories. There's a great essay by a Harvard Law professor called Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris, Harvard Law Review, that I also read. Highly recommend it. So there's that aspect of exploitation that creates these categories. Our entry into the workforce. All the categories are really artifacts of the creation of different American exploited workforces of the other, right? But the other side of the ethnic race question is that those of us who are thrown into those categories then use them as terms of solidarity and alliance. So the African people who came from all these different tribes and nations in Africa didn't think of themselves as black. They are thrown together, and black becomes this identity. Black power, you know, evolves from Negro to black to African American, back to black, you know, and so that term has also been shifting. And so Latino is really useful as the expression to me of an alliance. You're from Nevada, I'm from California, I'm Guatemalan, you're of Mexican descent, right? But we're both Latinos, and this is a Latino conversation. when we both talk, this is a Latino event or Hispanic event. And so those terms, the term is useful for that. You know, Latino is wonderful when it gets a million of us on the streets to march for immigration reform. Yay, that's great. It feels artificial when it's, a marketing campaign, and when it's Drinko de Mayo or whatever, and we're also celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with these superficial events, or when white movie makers take Dia los Muertos symbolism and put it in a James Bond movie, then it starts to feel really empty, right? Because it's like this, and so that's the basic tension in these identities. And in our case, in Latino, the case of Latino, it's a term that privileges our European descent and erases our indigeneity and our Africanness. Because really, most of us are kind of a mixture of all three. I'm from Guatemala, and Guatemala is definitely it's a European, indigenous, and also African place. And not, let me also throw in, it's also Chinese, but that's another story, right? And so Latino just simplifies all of that, and it evens it out, and it just, it doesn't, it obscures all the colorism in our community, the discrimination within our own families against the dark versus the light, and all the things that we see. So it's a very useful term. To me, it speaks of a common experience. One, as I say in my book, Latino is a story of empire, but it's also one that is artificial, and so I don't get hung up on labels. And in practice, neither do most Latino people, because we end up, as I say in my book, we end up saying like, no, what are you? Well, I'm from Vancouver. My father was from Cuba, but my mother is from Ireland. And people have all these long explanations, and they're sort of embarrassed that they have to do that, but that's who they are, And so to me, especially since there is so much mixing in Latino identity, it's confusing to people. And then we have the media sort of picking up on the Latinx and using it, and not a lot of people being really resentful of that. And now we have Latine, which is used in circle among us in intellectual and cultural, but isn't used. You won't hear the guys outside the street calling themselves Latine. So yeah, so to me, I don't. It's not a useful discussion. It's like trying to discover how many angels there are on the head of a pin. It's not which one we should call ourselves. No, I mean, it's like it's all kind of like it's complicated and ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think an added layer to all of this, and something that I don't hear many people talk about, is just like the impact that colonization had in how we even see ourselves. Because, I'll just give you an example. Like, clearly, I know that I have Indigenous heritage.
Yes.
I can't tell you what it is. I can't tell you. I can't tell you. I can't speak another language. I can't tell you where my people really came from. And that makes me sad. But
Yes.
that's intentional, right? That's like a product of colonization. Like that's an intentional thing to erase identity. And I know in Mexico, particularly, we were, taught to embrace a mestizo identity for those very purposes. But I just think that's like another added layer. I think about the census and how people had such a difficult time filling that out. And I know they've made some changes now, but for many of us, it is hard to like talk about race and ethnicity because we don't know. We don't know a lot of our roots and a lot of our heritage, other than we can identify perhaps a country that maybe our parents came from or grandparents, right?
Absolutely. And it's just it's asking to give a simple solution to a complicated question, which is a beautifully complicated and textured story. And I just really believe as a writer and just embracing complexity, and and all of I love it that when I meet somebody who's Filipino and Latino, or or Latino and Chinese, and it's like it's just the continuing story of our journey in this country.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go ahead and shift to audience questions? And as a reminder for our audience, please drop any questions you have in the chat or using the Q&A function. We have a couple of here. I actually wanted to start with the question from Anna related to the book cover. Can you tell us how you chose the title of this book and the meaning of the cover art?
Yes. Well, the title is inspired by W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. which is a book that was written in the early 20th century by this African-American scholar and thinker and activist. Really, canonical book in American discussion about race and inequality. So that's where the title comes from. That's why it's Our Migrant Souls, from the Souls of Black Folk. And the cover art is by Rodrigo Corral, who is a Colombian American, one of the, I think, actually the most respected and leading book designer in the United States. And he's designed the covers to my last 4 books or so, I think. Yes, 4 books. No, 5 books. He's designed the cover to my last 5 books. And this one, we had, lots of, the bird is a symbol of migration. It's become kind of iconic and in itself, this image. It's appeared in many places. And so I'm really absolutely happy with what Rodrigo did. And he's an amazing artist. And it was Rodrigo Corral, and using the bird often as a symbol of immigration, and because birds migrate.
Yeah, that's what I picked up on it, actually.
Yes.
The bird made me think of migration, but it is a beautiful cover. So I'll ask you this question. Not sure if you're able to answer, but somebody asks, given how diverse our ethnicity is, what do you think accounts for the dearth of diverse Latino representation in Hollywood and TV and or film?
Well, as you know, Hollywood is a money-making business. And it's the storytelling genre that is the most expensive, that takes the most money to make. And we're just not perceived as a money spending, wealthy demographic worth going after. That's what it boils down to. And so there isn't we don't get a complicated Netflix series about a Latino family that deals with class and colorism and all this stuff, which is in our everyday lives, because they don't think, the people who make the decisions don't think that we're going to spend money to see that, or they don't think that we think that way. They think that we just want comedies and, the occasional movie about identity, which is, usually at a very not a very complicated emotional or political level. And so it's that's at its heart. It's a question of, and the reason why we're not in Hollywood is the same reason why when you pick up a luxury magazine, you don't see any mestizo Latino people in the ads. You'll see Black people, you'll see white people, you'll see mixed race couples, you'll see lots of Asian people, but you don't see any Latino people when you pick up, any ad, any magazine that's marketed to the higher end demographics, higher income, and so that's the main reason why. And and it just takes there are very few Latino people in decision making, in Hollywood, in the studios. No, there isn't. And it just goes to the perception of us as people who are not going to invest the time to watch those kinds of really important dramas. And that's the main reason why.
Yeah, and even in Latin America, novelas, I love my novelas, but even as a child, I'm like, why does no one who looks like me ever is the star? I'm always
right.
Look like me, or always the maid, or the village person. But there's still, we didn't even touch colorism, but
yes, we barely have touched on it. Yes.
Right, but that's a whole nother layer there. And in the US, we do drive ticket sales. We're the ones who go to the movies more than any other demographic group. But you're right, they absolutely don't understand that we are thirsty. We want to see ourselves on screen. But I also think they set us up to fail. Our shows don't get the level of funding as other shows do. They don't get promoted as well as other movies and shows do. I've seen a lot of that, especially recently with a lot of the good shows that were canceled. And I'm they never give us the opportunity. They set us up to fail. And then they blame that failure and say they don't want to take another shot at,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Hollywood is also just really averse to risk taking. So, they're going to keep trying the things that work. And so they haven't seen something yet that works consistently. And so, it's, making a movie is a lot like starting a a business, like starting and so that's really what the decisions come down to very often. They're very risk averse, very cautious. And I say this from personal experience.
Interesting. That's also require a follow-up at some point, because I'd love to hear more about that at some point. But I know we have a lot of questions here, so I'll jump to this one next. This one is very interesting to me, just given the times that we're in. But the question asks, do you see the evolution of the Chicano movement coming about in new generations? How do your students see themselves politically in today's polarizing world?
Wow, what a great question. Well, when I think about the Chicano movement, I think about a very intimate movement. I think about people who had a very strong sense of themselves in this country and who created a kind of narrative and almost a mythology about themselves, right? I mean, there's all the imagery that we associate with the Chicano movement, the artistic imagery, which evolved now into so many other things like Dia de los Muertos becoming this is something that's happened in our lifetimes since the 1980s. Dia de los Muertos became a thing because of the Chicano activists who started working in the arts and took this Mexican holiday and brought it to American cities and started parades and with low rider parades for Dia de los Muertos, those kind of things. So yes, I see an incredible amount of pride, but I don't see, I think part of the problem is that the Chicano movement was this Mexican American identity, and there was this sort of cultural grounding to that. And the Latino movement in this country is Latino population now is so incredibly diverse. What unites the Puerto Rican, Nuyorican with the Mexican guy in the Southwest, with the Salvadoran guy in Washington, with the Cuban in Miami. I think, well, there is one thing, obviously, and it's immigration. And we saw a powerful movement in 2006 where there were millions of people on the streets. I think that people were a little bit taken aback by the reaction to that way back when. But it's time, it's been 20 years since that almost. It'll be 20 years, a 20-year anniversary of the 2006 movement. And I think my students politically are more aware than ever before. I mean, they're extremely aware of race and gender as issues. I think they're very inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that there's a really powerful solidarity among young people, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what I'm waiting to happen is for there to be a kind of trans race ethnic unified movement around issues of class. I think that the one thing that maybe I'm hoping that we bring to the table is that we bring this working class identity and working class struggle back into the American mainstream, which has happened in Los Angeles, where most of the most powerful unions have Latino leaders in Southern California. So yes, I see definite identification with idea of struggle. Often I think it's very cultural, and in the sense of like it's about music people listen to. And I hope that it evolves into concrete political goals, more concrete political goals, and a kind of optimism about that. Because right now, I think a lot of people feel really beaten down by just how daunting the idea of immigration reform, which isn't going to happen until we have millions of people on the streets. That's the only way it's going to happen. That's the only thing that's going to shift the political landscape, is when there's another mass movement. I can say that until I'm blue in the face, but until it happens, there's not going to be any change.
I did have a follow-up question to that, because you raised something that's really interesting that I agree with. And that's this idea that like we do need a quote unquote, like another rainbow coalition, right?
Yes.
Where we organize around, working class versus, especially now when we're seeing income inequality just really explode. And you alluded to this earlier in the talk, but the Black-white category came because we needed to keep enslaved people enslaved forever.
Yes.
And that's how
Yes.
race came about. And we see that throughout US history, like race literally came about to oppress, but it was driven by the property class. Just given that the US does have, a racialized history, I do agree that we need to unite like around class, but do you think we're also a country that can forget about race, and should we? Because don't you think reparative justice would require that we acknowledge the history of racism in the US?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just wrote a book about that, so I couldn't agree more. Um, Absolutely. But I think also that there are, woundings of class that are not talked about, especially among white people, because, that's what white is supposed to be. I remember I taught at the University of Oregon. I had, 90% white students. And they were, like the Latino students and the white students, a lot of them were kind of poor and working class. But the Latino students had a whole system of thinking to explaining why they were poor. Well, my parents crossed the border but we're tough and we believe in ourselves. And there was just this incredible amount of pride. But when you talk to a white student my white students in Oregon about why they were poor, or it's like, well, it's your own fault. They don't have, it's like, because you have all the opportunity, so it has to be your own fault because we're supposed to be living in this meritocracy. And so that's what white is. White is this state of mind in which you erase your connections to other people and you just live in this economic plane, you know? And so I think that once we start to take that apart, some powerful things are going to start to happen, right? And yes, I think that uh, you know, part of that is just having what's already happening in this country, is that a lot of people are becoming aware of each other's struggles. I mean, my book is a lot of it's about African American struggle and our relationship to that, our relationship to black and white. And I think that to me, the way forward is for us to have mutual respect for our struggles, which is exactly why there's all this censorship movement, because that's very dangerous. The censorship of ethnic studies, these are, these that's very dangerous to the status quo. And that's one of the reasons why we see that spreading across the country.
Absolutely, which I think is another important reason we should have conversations like this, because these conversations are literally being silenced across the country at this time. Also, what you said reminded me of something. What you said about your students when you were teaching in Oregon reminded me of something that my mom would say to me. You know, my mom was a Mexican immigrant, and we lived in a small town, but it was on a freeway, so you would often see people who were experiencing homelessness, asking for money, and my mom would always be like, "I don't get it. Like, never help them. Like, they had every opportunity, and if I did it, you know, if I have somewhere to live and if I have a car, like." You know, and I never agreed with her, but anyway, what you said just reminded me of that. Like my mom said that to this day. I did want to end this conversation with a call to action. And I think this last question is a really good call to action. And then of course, I want to give you some time for any last thoughts and tell us where we can get your book. But this last question, I think, is a great one to end off on. So how can Latinos in positions of power or leadership help address the tensions, meanings, and myths of Latino?
Wow. Well, I think it's important to internalize this practice of curiosity about each other, about ourselves, and about the country that we're part of. I think that it's important that we not just make ourselves experts on all things Latino, but understand, the relationship between our history and also Latin American history. I think one of the great crimes in this country is, especially in California, is that, the Mexican Revolution isn't taught in schools. The Mexican Revolution has a lot to say about the way the Southwest became the Southwest. And so I think that embracing curiosity, study, making alliances, with other groups, to me, that's the most important thing. Also, I have to say too, listening to a younger generation. I know I'm of a certain generation where a lot of people who are my age are just like, they're cynical and they think that young people are cynical and apathetic, that they just want to be on their phones, all the things that older people say about a younger generation, where I see curiosity, ambition, trauma. Yes, absolutely. And so I think that listening to younger people, having an optimistic view of where they're going to take us, because the future by definition is going to be created by them, and so I think there's just so much wonderful in I see in youth culture, just so many wonderful things. you know, I mean, even take something like reggaeton. Reggaeton is this incredibly complicated musical form that involves relationships with Latin American music and blackness and hip hop and trap music and everything. And so, so I think that you know, being aware of not being afraid of all the diversity and the complexity in our community is a good start.
Well, thank you. Very well said. And to close us out, where can people find your book?
Oh, yes. Well, my book, Our Migrant Souls, is at sale in just about every bookseller near you. And I don't want to say Amazon because they own everything, but almost every independent bookstore will be able to drum you up a copy next month in May. It comes out in paperback. Also, it's coming out in a Spanish translation called Nuestras Almas Migrantes. Next month, you know, here we're talking about economics. My U.S. American publisher could not find anybody to buy the Spanish rights because all the Spanish publishers nobody wanted to buy it. So they are putting out their first ever book in Spanish. My U.S. New York publisher, FSG, is putting out a version in Spanish next month. So it will be available in Spanish. And so, yes, it's also an audiobook if you want to recommend it to your friends. There also should be an Audible in Spanish coming out. I think, because they were the ones who helped encourage me, Audible in Spanish, to seek out a Spanish translation. So it's available just about everywhere. And thank you for you know, telling your friends about it, and also and you know, just recommend reading in general. My book contains recommendations for lots of deeper reading about questions of race and Latin American history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I'm really excited to hear about the Spanish version. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Hector. And thank you to our audience. I hope everybody has a wonderful night.